The hay beneath Grace, Kimball felt softer than any bed she had known in 3 weeks of traveling, though the sharp edges poked through her thin dress, and the smell of horses filled every breath. She had curled herself into the darkest corner of the livery stable in Shoshone, Idaho, hoping the owner would not discover her before dawn when she could slip away and continue searching for work, for food, for anything that might keep her alive one more day. The autumn of 1882 had turned cold earlier than expected, and the wind whistling through the slats of the stable wall made her pull her shawl tighter around her shoulders, though it did little good against the chill that had settled deep in her bones. She had been asleep perhaps 2 hours when the creak of the stable door jolted her awake, and she pressed herself further into the corner, her heart hammering against her ribs as heavy footsteps moved through the darkness. A lantern flared to life, casting long shadows across the stalls, and Grace held her breath as the light swung in her direction. The man holding the lantern stopped when he saw her, his tall frame silhouetted against the golden glow, and for a moment neither of them moved. "Well now," he said, his voice low and rough but not unkind. "That is not a proper place for sleeping." Grace scrambled to her feet, smoothing down her dress with trembling hands. "I am sorry, sir. I will leave right away. I did not mean any harm." He stepped closer, and the lantern light revealed a face weathered by sun and wind, with dark hair that fell past his collar and eyes the color of winter sky. He could not have been much older than 30, with the lean build of a man who spent his days on horseback, and there was something in his expression that made Grace's fear ease just slightly. "Where exactly are you planning to go at this hour?" he asked, glancing toward the door where darkness pressed against the small window. "It is past midnight and cold enough to freeze a person solid out there." "I will manage," Grace said, though her voice wavered. "I have been managing." He studied her for a long moment, taking in her worn dress, her tangled blonde hair, the shadows under her green eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights. Then he set the lantern down on a wooden post and crossed his arms over his chest. "I've got a bed you can use," he said. "Nothing fancy, but it is warm and dry and a sight better than sleeping in hay." Grace stared at him, uncertain whether to feel grateful or more frightened than before. "I do not have money to pay for lodging." "Did I ask for money? Then why would you help me?" He shrugged, picking up the lantern again. "My mother raised me to have some decency. The name is Pierce Vaughn, and I own a small ranch about 2 miles outside of town. I came in to check on my horse because he threw a shoe this afternoon, and I wanted to make sure he was not favoring that leg. But since I am here and you are here, seems to me the decent thing is to offer you a proper place to sleep." "I am Grace Kimball," she said quietly, "and I do not want to be any trouble." "Too late for that," Pierce said, but there was a hint of warmth in his voice that took the edge off the words. "You have already troubled my conscience. Come on, before we both freeze to death having this conversation." Grace hesitated, weighing her options. She could refuse and spend the rest of the night shivering in the stable, hoping the owner would not find her and have her arrested for trespassing. Or she could trust this stranger who had kind eyes and an offer of warmth. Her body made the decision before her mind could catch up, and she found herself following Pierce out into the cold night air. His horse was tied outside, a sturdy bay gelding that snorted softly as Pierce untied the reins. He helped Grace up onto the saddle, his hand steady and respectful, then swung up behind her. The warmth of his body at her back was immediate and overwhelming, and Grace felt tears prick at her eyes from the simple relief of not being cold for the first time in days. They rode through the quiet streets of Shoshone, past buildings that were dark except for the occasional window still lit with lamplight. The town was small but growing, built along the railroad line that had brought prosperity to this part of Idaho. Grace had arrived on that same railroad 3 weeks ago with nothing but the clothes on her back and $20 she had saved from 2 years of working as a seamstress in Denver. The money had run out faster than she expected, and the job she had hoped to find seemed always to go to someone else, someone with connections or family or simply better luck. The ranch house appeared as a darker shape against the dark sky, with a stone chimney rising from one end and a porch that wrapped around the front. Pierce dismounted first and helped Grace down, then led his horse to the small barn behind the house. Grace stood uncertainly in the yard, wondering if she had made a terrible mistake, but when Pierce returned, he simply gestured toward the door. "Come inside where it is warm," he said. "I will get the fire built up." The interior of the house was modest but clean, with rough wooden walls and furniture that looked handmade but sturdy. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall of the main room, and Pierce knelt to add wood to the embers still glowing from earlier in the evening. The flames caught quickly, sending light and heat spreading through the space, and Grace moved closer without thinking, holding her hands out toward the warmth. "When did you last eat?" Pierce asked, straightening up and brushing bark from his hands. "Yesterday morning," Grace admitted. "There was a church giving out soup." Pierce muttered something under his breath that might have been a curse, then moved to the kitchen area. He pulled out a loaf of bread, some cheese, and cold meat, arranging them on a plate that he set on the table. "Eat," he said. "I am going to get some blankets for the spare room." Grace did not need to be told twice. She sat down and ate slowly, forcing herself not to devour the food too quickly even though her stomach ached with hunger. The bread was fresh, the cheese sharp and creamy, and she closed her eyes with each bite, savoring flavors she had nearly forgotten. By the time Pierce returned with an armful of quilts, she had finished most of the plate and felt almost human again. "The room is just through there," Pierce said, nodding toward a door off the main room. "It is not much, but the bed is decent and the roof does not leak. There is a pitcher of water for washing, and if you need anything else, my room is on the other side of the house." "Thank you," Grace said, the words feeling entirely inadequate. "I do not know how to repay your kindness." "You do not have to repay anything," Pierce said. "Just get some sleep. We can talk more in the morning." Grace stood and moved toward the room he had indicated, then paused at the doorway. "Why are you doing this? You do not know me. I could be anyone." Pierce was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful in the firelight. "My sister ran away from home when she was 17, he said finally. "Headed west to make her own way, same as a lot of folks. I never saw her again. I like to think that somewhere along the road, someone showed her the same kindness I am showing you. Makes me feel like maybe she was all right, at least for a while." "I am sorry," Grace whispered. "Do not be sorry. Just take the help when it is offered, and maybe pass it along someday when you are in a position to do the same." Grace nodded and slipped into the small room, closing the door gently behind her. The bed was narrow, but the mattress was thick, and when she lay down and pulled the quilts over herself, she felt warmth seep into her body for the first time in what felt like forever. She meant to stay awake, to think about what she would do next, but exhaustion claimed her within minutes, and she fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. When she woke, pale sunlight was streaming through the single window, and she could hear the sound of someone moving around in the main room. Grace sat up slowly, disoriented for a moment before the events of the previous night came rushing back. She smoothed her hair as best she could and used the water in the pitcher to wash her face and hands, then ventured out of the bedroom. Pierce was at the stove, cooking something that smelled divine. He glanced over his shoulder when he heard her footsteps and nodded toward the table. Morning. Hope you like eggs and bacon. Coffee is already made. Grace sat down, feeling awkward and out of place in the morning light. You did not have to make breakfast for me. I was making it for myself anyway, Pierce said. Not much extra effort to cook for two. He brought plates to the table and they ate together, the silence between them not quite comfortable but not hostile either. Grace found herself stealing glances at him, trying to understand what kind of man would take in a stranger without asking for anything in return. He had strong hands, scarred from years of ranch work, and there was a steadiness about him that made her feel safe in a way she had not felt since leaving Denver. "What brought you to Shoshone?" Pierce asked after a while. "I was hoping to find work," Grace said. "I am a seamstress by trade, or I was. The shop where I worked in Denver closed down when the owner died, and his son had no interest in keeping it running. I heard there were opportunities out west, new towns springing up that would need skilled labor." "There is work, if you know where to look," Pierce said. "Mrs. Henderson, who runs the boarding house, has been complaining that her curtains need mending, and I know for certain that the hotel could use someone to handle alterations for their guests. Shoshone might be small, but we are growing, and growing towns need all sorts of services." "I went to the hotel when I first arrived," Grace said quietly. "They told me they were not hiring. Did you talk to Mr. Morrison or just the clerk at the desk?" "The clerk." Pierce made a dismissive sound. "That would be Tommy Walsh, and he does not know his head from a hole in the ground. You need to talk to Morrison directly. He is the one who makes the hiring decisions." Grace felt a flicker of hope, fragile but real. "Do you think he would see me?" "I think if I introduced you, he would at least listen to what you have to offer." Pierce pushed his empty plate away and leaned back in his chair. "I've got some work to do around the ranch today, but this afternoon I can take you into town and we can stop by the hotel. In the meantime, if you want to make yourself useful, there is a pile of mending in the corner over there that has been sitting for 2 months. I am useless with a needle." "I would be happy to help," Grace said quickly. "It is the least I can do." She spent the morning working on Pierce's mending, finding a strange comfort in the familiar rhythm of pushing needle through fabric. The clothes were well worn but well made, practical garments designed for hard work and long days. As she stitched, she watched through the window as Pierce moved between the barn and the corral, working with horses that clearly trusted him. He had a patience with the animals that spoke of years of experience, and Grace found herself admiring the easy competence with which he moved. When the sun was high overhead, Pierce came in to make lunch, and they ate together again. The conversation came easier this time, with Grace telling him about growing up in Pennsylvania and Pierce sharing stories about life in Idaho. He had been born in Kansas, but came west with his family when he was 12, seeking better land and better opportunities. His parents had died within a year of each other 5 years ago, leaving him the ranch and a handful of livestock. He had built it up slowly, carefully, until he had a small but profitable operation breeding and training horses. "It is not fancy work," he said, "but it is honest and it is mine. That counts for something." "It counts for everything," Grace said softly. That afternoon, true to his word, Pierce hitched up a wagon and drove her into Shoshone. The town looked different in daylight, less threatening and more simply worn, the kind of place that was still finding its identity. Pierce took her directly to the hotel, a 2-story building with a painted sign that declared it the Silver Creek Hotel and Restaurant. Inside, the lobby was neat and well-maintained, with a polished front desk and chairs arranged near a pot-bellied stove. The man behind the desk was older than Pierce, with gray streaks in his dark hair and spectacles perched on his nose. He looked up when they entered and his expression brightened. "Pierce Vaughn, as I live and breathe," What brings you to town 2 days in a row? Business, Mr. Morrison. I wanted to introduce you to Miss Grace Kimball. She is a seamstress from Denver, newly arrived in Shoshone and looking for work. I thought you might have need of her services. Morrison studied Grace with sharp eyes, taking in her neat appearance despite her worn dress. Is that so? What kind of experience do you have? Grace straightened her shoulders and met his gaze. I worked for Mrs. Adelaide Franklin's dress shop in Denver for 2 years. I can do everything from basic mending to custom tailoring. I am good with measurements and I work quickly without sacrificing quality. Mrs. Franklin, Morrison repeated. I know that name. She made a dress for my wife 10 years ago when we were passing through Denver. Fine work, as I recall. She trained me herself, Grace said. I would be happy to show you examples of my stitching if you have any doubt about my abilities. Morrison tapped his fingers on the desk, considering. Truth is, we do need someone. I have had 3 guests in the past month ask about alterations, and I have had to send them to Mrs. Chen over on 3rd Street. She does good work, but she is getting on in years and cannot take on as much as she used to. If you are interested, I could offer you space in one of the back rooms to set up a small workspace. You would handle alterations for hotel guests and any other custom work that comes your way. I would take 10% of your earnings in exchange for the space and for sending business your direction. Grace felt her heart leap. That sounds more than fair, Mr. Morrison. When could I start? How about tomorrow morning? I will have the room cleaned out and ready by then. You will need to provide your own supplies, but I can advance you enough to get the basics if needed. I have needles and thread with me, Grace said quickly. Everything else I can manage. They settled the details, and when Grace and Pierce left the hotel, she felt lighter than she had in months. Real work, a real chance to support herself and build something stable. Pierce seemed pleased as well, smiling as he helped her back into the wagon. Told you Morrison was the one to talk to, he said. I cannot thank you enough, Grace said. For everything. The food, the shelter, the introduction. You have changed my life in the space of a single day. You did the hard part, Pierce said. I just pointed you in the right direction. They stopped at the general store so Grace could purchase a few necessities with the advance Morrison had given her, then headed back toward the ranch. As they rode, Grace felt the weight of uncertainty that had been crushing her for weeks begin to lift. She had work, she had a plan, and she had met someone who had shown her kindness without expecting anything in return. It felt like the beginning of something, though she could not quite name what. That evening, over a dinner of stew and biscuits, Pierce brought up the subject Grace had been dreading. So, now that you have work, you will be needing a place to stay in town, he said. The boarding house has rooms, though I am not sure what Mrs. Henderson charges. Grace set down her spoon, her appetite suddenly gone. I am sure I can afford something once I start earning money. But not right away, Pierce said. It was not a question. No, Grace admitted. Not right away. Pierce was quiet for a moment, looking down at his plate. When he spoke again, his voice was careful, measured. You are welcome to stay here until you have enough saved. The spare room is just sitting empty anyway, and it is no trouble having you around. Truth is, it is kind of nice having someone to talk to at dinner. I could not impose on you like that, Grace said, even as relief flooded through her. It is not an imposition if I am offering, Pierce said firmly. You can help around the house if it makes you feel better about it. Cooking, mending, whatever you have time for. But mainly, I just do not like the idea of you sleeping in the livery stable again, or going hungry trying to save every penny for a room. Grace felt tears threaten again, and she blinked them back furiously. You barely know me. Why are you being so kind? Maybe I am a terrible judge of character, Pierce said with a slight smile. Or maybe I can tell when someone deserves a fair chance. Either way, the offer stands." "Then I accept," Grace said softly, "and I promise I will not be here any longer than necessary." "Stay as long as you need to," Pierce said. "I mean that." Over the following weeks, a routine developed between them. Grace would rise early and help Pierce with breakfast, then ride into town with him when he had business there or take the wagon herself if he did not. She worked at the hotel during the day, doing alterations and mending and slowly building a reputation for quality work. In the evenings, she returned to the ranch and helped with dinner, and afterwards they would sit by the fire and talk. Grace learned that Pierce had a dry sense of humor that emerged when he felt comfortable, and that he had strong opinions about everything from horse breeding to the territorial government. He learned that Grace had left Pennsylvania because her father had wanted to arrange a marriage for her to a man twice her age, and that she had been saving money to escape for 3 years before she finally had enough to buy a train ticket west. They talked about books they had read, places they wanted to see, dreams they had for the future. "I want to own my own shop someday," Grace confided one evening as she mended one of Pierce's shirts. "A real dress shop with a sign out front and a window display. Somewhere women can come to have beautiful things made, not just practical ones." "You will have it," Pierce said with certainty. "I have seen your work. You are good enough to have customers lining up." "It takes more than skill," Grace said. "It takes money to rent a space, to buy fabric and supplies, to advertise. I am saving as much as I can, but it will be years before I have enough." "Years pass whether you are working towards something or not," Pierce pointed out. "Might as well be moving in the right direction." Grace smiled at him over her sewing. "Is that cowboy wisdom?" "That is common sense wisdom," Pierce said. "Cowboys are not known for their long-term planning." As October turned to November, the weather grew colder and the work on the ranch became more demanding. Pierce spent long days preparing for winter, making sure the barn was secure and the horses had enough feed stored up. Grace helped where she could, learning to care for the animals and manage the daily tasks that kept the ranch running. She discovered that she liked the physical work, the way it tired her body but cleared her mind. She also discovered that she liked watching Pierce work, liked the way he moved with quiet confidence, liked the sound of his voice when he talked to the horses. It was a realization that crept up on her slowly, until one morning she woke up and understood with sudden clarity that she was developing feelings for the man who had taken her in. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying, because she had no idea if he felt anything similar, and she could not bear the thought of making things awkward between them when he had done so much for her. Grace tried to keep her feelings hidden, but it became harder as the weeks passed. There were small moments that made her heart race. Pierce's hand on her waist as he helped her down from the wagon, the way he smiled at her across the dinner table, the sound of his laughter when she said something that amused him. She caught herself thinking about him when she should have been focusing on her work, imagining what it might be like to have something more than friendship between them. It was mid-November when everything changed. Grace had been living at the ranch for nearly 6 weeks, and she had saved most of what she earned from her work at the hotel. She was beginning to think about looking for a room in town, even though the thought of leaving the ranch made her chest ache. She was walking that tightrope between gratitude and longing, trying to figure out when the right time would be to move out without seeming ungrateful or presumptuous. The day started like any other, with Grace riding into town to work while Pierce stayed at the ranch to work with a new horse he was training. She spent the morning hemming a dress for one of the hotel guests, and the afternoon taking measurements for a suit that needed altering. By the time she closed up her workspace and headed out to get the wagon, the sun was already setting, and the temperature had dropped sharply. The wagon was where she had left it, tied up in front of the general store, but when she climbed up and tried to get the horse moving, something was clearly wrong. The animal limped forward a few steps and then stopped, unwilling to put weight on its front left leg. Grace climbed down and examined the hoof, finding a stone lodged deep in the frog. She worked it out carefully, but the horse was still favoring the leg, and she knew it would be cruel to make it pull the wagon all the way back to the ranch. Grace stood in the street as darkness fell, trying to decide what to do. She could stable the horse in town and walk back to the ranch, but it was 2 miles in the cold and dark. She could rent a room at the boarding house for the night and deal with everything in the morning, but that meant spending money she was trying to save. Or she could find Pierce and let him know what had happened, except she was not sure where exactly he would be at this hour. She was still debating when she heard her name called and turned to see Pierce riding toward her on his bay gelding. Relief washed over her so strongly that she felt her knees weaken. "I saw you had not come back yet and got worried," Pierce said, dismounting. "What happened?" Grace explained about the horse's hoof, and Pierce examined the leg himself, his expression concerned. "He needs rest and probably a poultice. I will ride him back slowly tomorrow. Tonight you are coming with me." He helped Grace up onto his horse and swung up behind her, just like that first night, and they rode out of town together. The similarities to that first journey were not lost on Grace, but everything felt different now. She knew Pierce, trusted him, cared about him in ways that went far beyond gratitude. And as his arms came around her to hold the reins, she let herself lean back against his chest, soaking in his warmth and his presence. "Thank you for coming to find me," she said softly. "Of course I came," Pierce said, his voice close to her ear. "Did you think I would just leave you stranded in town? I did not know if you would even notice I had not returned." "Grace," Pierce said, and there was something in his tone that made her breath catch. "I always notice when you are not around." They rode in silence the rest of the way, but Grace could feel her heart pounding so hard she was sure Pierce must be able to hear it. When they reached the ranch, he helped her down and took care of his horse while she went inside to start dinner. But her hands were shaking as she peeled potatoes, and she kept losing track of what she was doing. Pierce came in just as she was setting the table, and he washed up at the basin before joining her. They ate quietly, the air between them feeling charged with something unspoken. Grace was acutely aware of every movement he made, every glance in her direction. Finally, unable to bear the tension any longer, she set down her fork and looked directly at him. "Pierce, I need to tell you something." He met her gaze, his expression serious. "All right." "I have been thinking that it is time for me to find a room in town," Grace said, the words coming out in a rush. "You have been more than generous, letting me stay here for so long, and I have saved enough now to afford the boarding house. I do not want to overstay my welcome or take advantage of your kindness." Pierce was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working as if he were choosing his words carefully. "Is that what you want, to move into town?" "I do not want to be a burden," Grace said. "That is not what I asked." "Is that what you want?" Grace looked down at her plate, her throat tight. "No," she whispered. "It is not what I want, but I do not know what else to do." "Why not?" "Because I am falling in love with you," Grace said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "And I know that is not what you signed up for when you offered me a place to stay. You were being kind to someone who needed help, not looking for anything more. So I think I should leave before I make things even more complicated." The silence that followed felt like an eternity. Grace could not bring herself to look up, could not bear to see pity or discomfort in Pierce's eyes. She was mentally calculating how quickly she could pack her few belongings when she heard his chair scrape back, and then he was kneeling beside her, his hands covering hers. "Grace, look at me." She forced herself to meet his gaze and was shocked to see tenderness there, and something that looked almost like relief. "I did not offer you a bed that first night looking for anything," Pierce said slowly. "You are right about that, but somewhere along the way, things changed for me too. I started looking forward to coming in at the end of the day because I knew you would be here. I started thinking about what you might like when I was in town, wondering if certain things would make you smile. And I realized about 2 weeks ago that I was in love with you, but I did not know how to tell you without making you feel like I expected something in return for helping you." "You love me," Grace whispered. "I love you," Pierce confirmed. "I love your strength and your determination. I love the way you talk to the horses like they are old friends. I love how you hum when you are sewing and do not even realize you are doing it. I love everything about you, Grace, and I do not want you to move into town unless that is truly what you want." "It is not," Grace said, tears streaming down her face now. "I want to stay here. I want to be with you." Pierce pulled her out of the chair and into his arms, and Grace wrapped herself around him, holding on like he was the only solid thing in a spinning world. He was warm and strong and real, and when he tilted her face up and kissed her, she felt like every hard thing she had endured to get to this moment had been worth it. They stood there in the middle of the kitchen for a long time, holding each other, kissing each other, murmuring words of love and relief. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were smiling through tears. "So you are not moving into town," Pierce said. "No, I am not moving into town," Grace agreed. "Good, because I have gotten used to having you around and I do not think I could go back to the way things were before." "What happens now?" Grace asked. "Now we figure it out together," Pierce said. "No rush, no pressure. We just take it one day at a time and see where it leads." "I like the sound of that." They finished dinner eventually and did the dishes together, and sat by the fire talking late into the night. Everything felt different now that the truth was out in the open, lighter and easier and full of possibility. When Grace finally went to bed in the spare room, she lay awake for a while, marveling at how much her life had changed since that night in the livery stable. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was one of the happiest times of Grace's life. She continued her work at the hotel, building a steady clientele and saving money toward her dream of owning a shop. But the ranch was where she felt most at home, working alongside Pierce, learning about the horses and the land, becoming part of the rhythm of his life as he became part of hers. They courted in the old-fashioned sense, taking things slowly and deliberately. Pierce took her to dances in town, to church socials, to dinners at the hotel. He held her hand in public and kissed her goodnight on the porch, and he treated her with a respect and tenderness that made her feel cherished. Grace cooked special meals for him, mended his clothes with extra care, left small surprises around the house for him to find. They talked about everything and nothing, learning each other's stories and dreams and fears. In January, Pierce asked her to marry him. They were sitting by the fire on a particularly cold night, and he simply turned to her and said, "Grace Kimball, will you be my wife?" "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, absolutely yes." They were married in March in a simple ceremony at the church in Shoshone, with half the town in attendance. Grace wore a dress she had made herself, pale blue with cream lace at the collar and cuffs, and Pierce wore his best suit and a look of such joy that several women in the congregation wept. Mr. Morrison gave Grace away, and Mrs. Henderson threw rice as they left the church. The ranch became truly home after that, with Grace moving her things out of the spare room and into the room she now shared with Pierce. She learned that he snored softly when he was deeply asleep, that he liked his coffee strong and his eggs over easy, that he talked to himself when he was working through a problem. He learned that she was ticklish on her right side, that she could not carry a tune but loved to sing anyway, that she had nightmares sometimes about being hungry and cold and alone. "You are never going to be alone again," he told her after one such nightmare. "I promise you that." "I know," she whispered. "I believe you." Spring turned to summer, and Grace discovered she was pregnant. She told Pierce one evening in July as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, and his whoop of joy probably echoed all the way to town. He was immediately protective and attentive, trying to do all her heavy work for her, until she finally had to tell him that she was pregnant, not made of glass. "I know," he said sheepishly. "I just want to make sure you and the baby are safe and healthy." "We are," Grace assured him. "But I am not going to spend the next 7 months sitting in a chair while you do everything. Let me help." They compromised, with Grace doing lighter work and Pierce taking on the more physically demanding tasks. Grace continued her sewing work at the hotel until she was too uncomfortable to sit for long periods, then arranged to take work home with her. She wanted to keep building her savings, knowing that starting a family meant even more expenses and also more reasons to have her own business someday. Their son was born on a cold February morning in 1884, with Mrs. Henderson acting as midwife and Pierce pacing holes in the kitchen floor until he was allowed to come in and meet his child. The baby had dark hair like his father and green eyes like his mother, and when Pierce held him for the first time, Grace saw tears on his cheeks. "What should we name him?" Pierce asked softly. They had discussed names for weeks without settling on anything, but now Grace knew with certainty. "Samuel," she said, "after your father." Pierce looked at her with such love that she felt her own eyes well up. "Samuel Vaughn, I like that. Hello, Samuel. Welcome to the world, little man." Those first months with a new baby were exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. Samuel was a good baby, quick to smile and reasonably good about sleeping, but he still required constant care and attention. Grace and Pierce took turns with the night feedings, stumbling through the house half asleep to warm milk and change diapers. They learned together, figuring out what worked and what did not, supporting each other through the difficult moments. "I had no idea it would be this hard," Pierce admitted one night after a particularly fussy evening. "I had no idea it would be this worth it," Grace replied, watching Samuel sleep in his cradle. As Samuel grew, Grace began to think seriously about opening her shop. She had saved a good amount of money, and her reputation in Shoshone was solid. She talked to Pierce about her plans, worried that he might want her to focus on the home and family instead, but he was immediately supportive. "You have been working toward this since before I met you," he said. "Of course you should do it. We will figure out how to make it work with Samuel." They found a small space on Main Street that was affordable, and Grace signed a lease in the summer of 1885. She spent weeks getting the shop ready, painting the walls, arranging furniture, hanging curtains in the window. Pierce built her a large work table and shelves for storing fabric and supplies. Samuel, now a toddler, played with scraps of cloth on the floor while his mother worked. The grand opening of Kimball's dress shop was in August, and it was more successful than Grace had dared to hope. Women came from Shoshone and the surrounding ranches to see what she had to offer, and she quickly found herself with more work than she could handle alone. She hired a young woman named Martha to help with basic sewing tasks, and by the end of the year the shop was profitable enough that Grace could pay herself a real salary. "I am so proud of you," Pierce told her one evening. "You set out to do something and you did it." "We did it," Grace corrected. "I could not have managed any of this without your support." "Partnership," Pierce said, pulling her close. "That is what marriage is supposed to be." The years that followed were full and busy and good. Samuel grew from a toddler into a bright, curious boy who loved horses as much as his father did. In 1887, Grace gave birth to a daughter they named Rose, who had her father's dark hair and serious expression. 2 years later came another daughter, Lily, who was blonde like Grace and seemed determined to explore everything she could reach. The ranch prospered as Pierce's reputation for training quality horses spread throughout the territory. The dress shop thrived as well, with Grace's custom work sought after by women from increasingly distant towns. Money was not abundant, but it was steady and reliable, enough to provide for the family and slowly improve the ranch buildings and equipment. There were hard times too. A drought in 1889 made feed expensive and water scarce. Samuel broke his arm falling from a horse when he was 8, and Grace spent 3 days barely sleeping while he recovered. Pierce's best breeding mare died giving birth to a foal that did not survive, and Grace held him while he grieved. Rose got scarlet fever when she was 4, and for a week they did not know if she would live or die. But they weathered each challenge together, leaning on each other and on the community they had built in Shoshone. The town had grown significantly since that night Grace had slept in the livery stable, and she and Pierce had grown with it, becoming respected members of the community, the kind of people others turned to when they needed help or advice. On their 10th wedding anniversary in 1893, Pierce took Grace back to Shoshone and showed her the livery stable where he had found her. "I still cannot believe how lucky I was that night," Grace said, standing in the spot where she had been sleeping. "Lucky," Pierce repeated. "Grace, you were desperate and alone and sleeping in hay. That was not luck." "It was lucky that you were the one who found me," Grace said. "It could have been someone cruel or someone who did not care, but it was you and you cared and you changed everything for me." Pierce put his arm around her waist and pulled her close. "You changed everything for me too. I thought I was fine on my own, that I did not need anyone else. But then you came into my life and I realized what I had been missing. You made everything better, Grace. You still do, every single day." "I love you," she said, reaching up to kiss him. "I will love you until the day I die." "That is good," Pierce said with a smile, "because I am planning on keeping you around for a very long time." They walked back through town hand in hand, past the dress shop that bore Grace's name, past the hotel where she had gotten her first real job, past the church where they had been married. Shoshone had become home in every sense of the word, the place where Grace had found not just safety and work, but love and family and purpose. The children were waiting when they got back to the ranch, with Samuel looking after his sisters and a cake that was slightly lopsided but made with love sitting on the kitchen table. They celebrated together as a family, telling stories and laughing, and Grace looked around at the faces she loved most in the world and felt overwhelming gratitude. That night, after the children were in bed, Grace and Pierce sat on the porch and watched the stars come out. It was a clear night, cool but not cold, and the sky was brilliant with light. "You ever think about how different your life might have been?" Pierce asked. "If you had not come west or if you had gone to a different town?" "Sometimes," Grace admitted, "but I try not to dwell on it. I might have ended up somewhere else with someone else, but I do not think I would have been as happy. Everything that happened, all the hard parts and the scary parts, they led me here, to you, and I would not trade that for anything." "Neither would I," Pierce said. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Grace Vaughn. The absolute best." They sat in comfortable silence, holding hands, watching the night settle around them. The ranch was quiet except for the occasional sound of a horse shifting in the barn or an owl calling from the trees. It was peaceful, this life they had built together, full of ordinary moments that added up to something extraordinary. As the years continued to pass, Grace and Pierce watched their children grow and develop into remarkable people. Samuel had his father's way with horses and his mother's determination, and by the time he was 16, he was helping to train horses and manage the ranch operations. Rose inherited Grace's skill with a needle and thread, and she began working in the dress shop when she was 14, showing a talent for design that surpassed even her mother's. Lily was the wild one, always climbing trees and racing horses and getting into scrapes, but with a good heart and fierce loyalty to her family. The shop expanded in 1895, taking over the adjacent space when the previous tenant moved out. Grace hired 2 more seamstresses and began offering a wider range of services, including bridal gowns and formal wear. She developed a reputation that extended well beyond Shoshone, and women sometimes traveled for days to have a dress made at Kimball's. "You should change the name," Pierce suggested one evening. "It is Vaughn's dress shop now, not Kimball's." "No," Grace said firmly. "I started it as Grace Kimball, and I want to keep that name. It reminds me of where I came from and what I built." "Fair enough," Pierce said. "I am just proud of you, that is all. I know you are, and I am proud of you too." By the turn of the century, Idaho had become a state and Shoshone had grown into a proper town with paved streets and electric lights. The ranch had grown as well, with Pierce now employing 2 full-time hands to help with the work. They had built a larger barn and added a second corral, and they were known throughout southern Idaho for producing reliable, well-trained horses. Samuel married in 1901, a sweet young woman named Rebecca who had grown up on a neighboring ranch. They built a small house on the far corner of Pierce's land, and Samuel took on more and more responsibility for running the ranch as Pierce got older. Grace and Pierce became grandparents when Rebecca gave birth to a baby girl in 1902, and they fell in love all over again with the tiny person who had Pierce's eyes and Grace's smile. Rose married 2 years later, a man who worked at the bank in Shoshone, and they moved into a house in town close to the dress shop. Lily, true to form, announced at 18 that she was going to college in Boise to become a teacher, shocking everyone and making her parents prouder than they knew how to express. "She is so brave," Grace said, watching Lily pack for her journey, "going off on her own like that." "She learned from the best," Pierce said. "You were not much older than her when you came west by yourself. That was different. I did not have a choice." "Maybe not," Pierce said, "but you made the most of it. You taught all our children that being brave means taking chances and working hard and not giving up when things get difficult. Lily is doing exactly what you taught her to do." As they entered their 50s, Grace and Pierce began to slow down just slightly, letting the next generation take on more responsibility while they enjoyed the fruits of their decades of hard work. They traveled occasionally, taking trips to Boise and even once to San Francisco, but they always returned to Shoshone with relief, glad to be home. The dress shop remained successful, though Grace began to step back and let Rose run the day-to-day operations. She still took on special projects, particularly wedding dresses, but she was content to let her daughter carry the business forward into the new century. Pierce similarly handed over more of the ranch management to Samuel, though he still worked with the horses every day because he could not imagine life without them. On a warm summer evening in 1908, Grace and Pierce celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary with a party at the ranch. All 3 children were there with their families, along with friends from town and neighboring ranches. There was food and music and dancing, and speeches that made both Grace and Pierce tear up. At one point, Grace found herself standing apart from the crowd, watching Pierce dance with their oldest granddaughter, and Mr. Morrison came to stand beside her. "I remember when Pierce brought you to the hotel that first day," Morrison said. "You looked half-starved and scared but determined. I knew right then you would make something of yourself." "You took a chance on me," Grace said. "I never forgot that." "You paid me back 100 times over," Morrison said, "but I also remember thinking that Pierce looked at you like you were something precious. Even then, before anything had started between you, he cared. It was good to see." "He saved my life," Grace said softly. "Not just that first night, but in every way that matters." "I think you saved his too," Morrison said. "He was lonely, even if he did not realize it. You gave him a reason to build something bigger than just a ranch." Grace smiled, watching Pierce spin the little girl and make her laugh. "We saved each other then." Later that night, after everyone had gone home and the children were settled in their old rooms or in town, Grace and Pierce sat on the porch as they had countless times before. They were both tired from the party, but it was a good tired, the kind that comes from being surrounded by love. 25 years, Pierce said, shaking his head. "Where did the time go?" "Into building a life," Grace said. "A really good life. Do you ever regret it? Marrying me, staying here instead of moving to a big city where your shop might have been even more successful?" "Never," Grace said firmly. "Not even for a moment. This is exactly where I was meant to be." Pierce reached over and took her hand, his thumb rubbing over her knuckles in a gesture that had become familiar over the years. "I asked you once if you believed me when I said you would never be alone again. Do you still believe it?" "I know it," Grace said. "You have proven it to me every single day for 25 years. You are stuck with me, Pierce Vaughn." "Thank God for that," he said with a smile. They sat together as the moon rose. Two people who had started as strangers in a livery stable and built something beautiful out of kindness and courage and love. The ranch around them was quiet, the family inside was safe, and the future stretched ahead with all its unknowns and possibilities. Grace thought back to that desperate girl sleeping in the hay, afraid and alone, and wished she could tell her that everything would be all right. That a cowboy would find her and offer her not just a bed but a home, not just kindness but love, not just shelter but a whole life worth living. That she would build a business and raise a family and find happiness in ways she never could have imagined. But that girl was gone now, transformed by time and experience into someone stronger, someone who knew her own worth, someone who was loved deeply and loved deeply in return. And Grace would not change a single moment of the journey that had brought her here. "I love you," she said, squeezing Pierce's hand. "I love you too," he replied. "Always have, always will." The stars wheeled overhead, the same stars that had been shining that cold November night in 1882, when everything changed. The world had moved on, progressing into a new century with automobiles and telephones and all manner of modern marvels. But some things remained constant: the land, the sky, and the love between two people who had found each other when they needed it most. Grace and Pierce grew old together on that ranch, watching their grandchildren grow and eventually welcoming great-grandchildren. The dress shop continued under Rose's management and eventually her daughter's, becoming an institution in Shoshone that lasted well into the 20th century. Samuel ran the ranch with the same care and dedication his father had shown, passing it down to his own son when the time came. Through it all, Grace and Pierce remained partners in every sense, supporting each other through illness and loss, celebrating triumphs and milestones, finding joy in the simple fact of being together. They never forgot that first night, never took for granted the chance meeting that had changed both their lives. When Pierce died in 1927 at the age of 75, Grace was beside him, holding his hand and telling him how much he had meant to her. And when Grace followed him 3 years later, surrounded by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, her last thoughts were of that cowboy in the livery stable, offering a frightened girl a bed and changing the course of her entire life. The story of how they met became family legend, passed down through generations. The ranch stayed in the Vaughn family, as did the dress shop building in town, physical reminders of what two people had built together. But the real legacy was not in property or businesses. It was in the lesson they taught through their lives. That kindness matters, that love can be found in unexpected places, and that sometimes the darkest moments are just before everything changes for the better. Their graves sat side by side in the Shoshone cemetery, under a large cottonwood tree that provided shade in summer. The headstone was simple, with their names and dates and a single line Pierce had requested. She needed shelter. He offered a home. Together they built a life. It was a fitting epitaph for a love story that had started with desperation and generosity and grown into something that touched everyone it reached. Because Grace and Pierce had not just found each other that night in 1882. They had found the possibility of hope, the power of compassion, and the transformative nature of love. And they had spent the rest of their lives honoring those gifts, showing through their actions that one moment of kindness could ripple outward into decades of happiness. That one offer of help could become the foundation for a family, a legacy, and a love story worth telling for generations to come.